Hello, this is Russell Hawley coming to you from the Tate Geological Museum at Casper College in Wyoming. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about reef builders. Now, when we think of reef building organisms today, we immediately think of scleractine corals. As a matter of fact, it's hard to say the word reef without plugging the word coral in there right in front of it. And indeed, nowadays, most reefs, almost all of them, are built by corals. Here's examples of some modern corals. Looking at them up close, you can see that they're pockmarked with lots and lots of little holes, each one of those having an individual coral polyp in it. In life, they kind of look like very, very small sea anemones. And we kind of think of that as the natural order of things. However, throughout geological history, there have been reefs and reef building organisms time and time again, but they aren't always corals. Indeed, even today, there are organisms that will help build up the reef that are not corals themselves, even though they may live in and among the corals. Here's an example. Here is a shell of a pelecypod, but sticking up to it, what's that? That is the tube of a serpulid worm. So serpulids build tubes out of calcium carbonate that they absorb out of the seawater, and the tube gets longer and longer, and they stay rooted to this spot, straining bits of seawater that drifts by. And serpulids can sometimes congregate in large masses with hundreds or thousands of these tubes all cemented to each other and growing up clustered together. Even if they don't in and of themselves build the reef, they will often be an important binding element in connecting the other parts of the reef together and helping to build it and strengthen it. And then if you go back in time, you can find periods of geological history where scleractinian corals were not building reefs at all. For example, during the Pennsylvanian or the Mississippian period, you might find reefs built out of these. These are horn corals, also known as rugose corals, and there would have been a very large polyp, the size of a small sea anemone, growing out of that cup when it was alive. Lots of these would all grow clustered together and form reefs about 300 million years ago. But this is not the reef-building coral of today. These guys became extinct about halfway through the Triassic period. And if you look at the Permian period, the major reef builders at that time were Bryozoa. These are just a few fragments of Bryozoa that were recovered from Anchor Dam near Thermopolis. And these would have been very abundant and numerous reef builders back during the Permian. But I think probably the weirdest of all the reef building organisms are probably these guys, the Rudests. This is a fossil of a rudest, and to look at it at first glance, you might say, oh, that's another kind of horn coral, isn't it? It's not. It's a pelecypod. This is more closely related to a clam than it is to a horn coral, but they have that same sort of sessile reef building style of life and reproduction and feeding. And in life, these would have formed vast reefs during the early Cretaceous period. So how do you get from something that looks like a clam to something that looks like this? Well, it's kind of interesting if you consider their evolutionary history. Your standard pelecypod, like this clam, for example, has a right shell and a left shell, and they are the same size. And the clam can rest on the sea bottom, but they spend a lot of time burrowing down underneath the surface and then communicating with the surface water by means of a siphon. But there's a group of ancient pelecypods related to oysters called Gryphea that had a different lifestyle. They didn't burrow at all. They spent all of their time resting on the seafloor. And to keep themselves in the proper orientation, one of the valves was very, very thick and heavy, and then the other one very thin, and it opened and closed like a lid. So they could open that up and filter food out of the seawater. When danger threatened, they could close that down and stay safe inside. And if rough waves or currents moved them around on the sea floor, the fact that that lower valve was so much thicker and heavier would keep them oriented in the proper position. Incidentally, when you look at it this way, it kind of looks like a big, gross, horny toenail. And for this reason, Graphea is sometimes referred to as the devil's toenails. Now, Graphea is not the ancestor of the Rudests, but you can see how the real ancestor of the Rudests might have looked something like this. And when it was alive, this down here, this valve, would have been rooted to the bottom or to other Rudests in the reef, and then there would have been another much thinner valve up on top functioning like a lid. So if you look over here is a reconstruction of what a colony of live Rudests might have been like when they were alive during the early Cretaceous period about 100 million years ago.